Do you remember when Halloween in the 80s was more chaos than candy? Those traditions, foggy plastic masks, sugar rushes, and nights that felt endless, were the heartbeat of every kid's October. When did our spookiest nights lose that wild, pumpkin-scented magic? It is hard to explain the excitement of opening that crinkly Ben Cooper costume box. Inside was a flat, noisy sheet of plastic with a printed superhero or monster and a hard mask that looked nothing like the picture on the package. The mask had 2 tiny nose holes and a rubber band that always snapped before the night was over. You would breathe inside it until it fogged up, smelling faintly of paint and sweat. But that was part of the magic. Kids felt like movie stars just by tying that fragile plastic around their backs. Walking down the block with dozens of other plastic heroes and princesses, you could hear the soft hiss of those outfits rubbing together in the cold October air. It was a sound every 1980s Halloween shared, a mix of excitement, cheap plastic, and freedom. Sure, the masks cracked, the capes ripped, and by house number 5 you were already carrying half your costume in one hand. But for that short window of time, you were unstoppable. Nothing felt more official than trick-or-treating in a Ben Cooper costume, even if you had to tape it back together halfway through the night. Every kid in the 1980s wanted one thing from McDonald's in October: the Halloween pail. Those orange, white, or green buckets shaped like pumpkins, ghosts, or witches were more than Happy Meal containers. They were trophies. Each year, the designs changed just enough to make you beg your parents for the new one. Kids proudly carried them around, using them for candy, crayons, or even as lunchboxes long after Halloween was over. The smell of McDonald's fries mixed with the excitement of choosing between McPumpkin, McBoo, or McGoblin was a ritual of its own. You did not just eat your Happy Meal, you earned your pail. It was sturdy enough to survive multiple Halloweens, which made it feel like a real treasure in a decade full of disposable toys. Those smiling pumpkin faces glowing under streetlights are burned into memory, a reminder of a time when one plastic bucket could define an entire season. For many of us, the McDonald's Halloween pail was the only trick-or-treating gear we ever needed, and we carried it proudly until the handle snapped. Before streaming, before on-demand, there was only one way to see It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, when it aired on television once a year. Families marked their calendars, popped popcorn, and gathered in their living rooms in pajamas to watch it together. The flicker of the television cast a soft glow across the room, and even the commercials felt special. It was a comforting constant in a decade that was changing fast. Linus waiting all night in the pumpkin patch while the rest of the Peanuts crew trick-or-treated was both funny and strangely meaningful. It reminded kids that belief itself was part of the holiday spirit. You could almost feel the chill of fall outside the window while the sound of that familiar piano theme filled the room. For many children of the 1980s, The Great Pumpkin was the official start of Halloween. Missing it meant missing the season itself. There was no recording, no replay, no skipping ahead. You watched it live, or you waited another year. That anticipation made it magical in a way nothing today can match. There was something both thrilling and miserable about wearing your Halloween costume to school. The day always started with excitement. You woke up early, trying not to ruin your face paint while eating cereal. But by lunchtime, you were sweating inside a plastic mask, wishing you could breathe again. You could hear the soft rip of capes catching on desks and the squeak of plastic masks as everyone tried to talk through tiny mouth holes. Someone always lost part of their costume before first recess, but it didn't matter. The laughter made up for it. Even the teachers secretly loved it, trying to teach while a classroom of tiny monsters and superheroes bounced in their seats. Polyester capes tangled in chair legs, fake vampire teeth clicked during spelling tests, and the classroom smelled like rubber masks and sugar. Still, no one cared. The Halloween parade through the hallways was the highlight of the day. You strutted in front of parents holding camcorders the size of toasters, while your teacher clapped along to Monster Mash. Everyone was a little self-conscious, but the joy of showing off your costume was worth it. Those school parades made every kid feel like a star for one afternoon, even if their mask elastic broke 5 minutes before showtime. In the 1980s, trick-or-treating moved indoors, to the mall. Parents saw it as the perfect solution to the era's growing fears about safety and strangers. Bright lights, clean floors, and climate control made mall trick-or-treating feel safe and civilized, even if it lacked the mystery of dark suburban streets. You could smell pretzels and popcorn mixing with the scent of latex masks as kids darted between department stores. The sound of sneakers squeaking on the tile and the faint echo of Halloween pop songs gave it a strange but comforting rhythm. There was always that one store clerk who handed out raisins instead of candy, and everyone pretended to be polite before groaning down the hall. Kids darted between stores collecting candy from smiling cashiers while parents shopped or grabbed coffee at Orange Julius. Some stores handed out coupons or stickers instead of candy, which always felt like a ripoff, but you took them anyway. The mall echoed with laughter, plastic masks, and the faint smell of new sneakers. You might even bump into friends from school, both of you proudly comparing haul sizes. Sure, it was a little less spooky than the real deal, but for many 1980s families, it became tradition. Halloween under fluorescent lights might sound strange now, but back then, it was pure magic. Sugar highs and safety in equal measure. Every neighborhood had that one parent who went all out for Halloween and turned their garage into a haunted house. It was usually just cardboard coffins, bed sheets for ghosts, and a boombox looping eerie noises. But it worked. The air smelled like fog machine chemicals and pumpkin candles, and the line of kids outside was always longer than expected. Half the fun came from not knowing what waited behind the next corner. A jump scare, a bucket of cold spaghetti brains, or a neighbor in a gorilla mask. The whole garage would glow under dim orange light bulbs, shadows dancing across rakes and lawn chairs like hidden monsters. Even parents who claimed to hate Halloween found themselves grinning as they watched their kids scream and laugh in equal measure. Parents huddled nearby sipping cider while kids dared each other to go in first. Inside, it was a maze of squeaky hinges, spaghetti brains, and peeled grape eyeballs. Someone always jumped out wearing a mask from last year's costume sale, and everyone screamed, laughed, and ran out grinning. These homemade haunted garages were the beating heart of small-town Halloween, built from nothing but imagination and cardboard. They made every cul-de-sac feel like a movie set. Long before elaborate haunted attractions, it was neighbors and kids creating their own version of fear and fun. When store-bought costumes sold out or money was tight, parents got creative with trash bags. One black garbage bag, a pair of scissors, and some orange tape could turn any kid into a witch, ghost, or superhero. It was quick, cheap, and surprisingly fun to make. The sound of the bag rustling was part of the costume itself. Every step crinkled like thunder. Kids would parade around the living room, proud of their shiny new outfits, while parents pretended not to laugh. A little creativity and a roll of duct tape could turn any kitchen into a costume factory. The smell of fresh plastic filled the kitchen as parents cut armholes and kids argued about who got the shiny bag. A little construction paper and a marker could transform a recycling bin into a costume workshop. Sure, it crinkled when you moved, and the static cling was unbearable, but no one cared. The pride of making your own costume was part of the fun. Plus, if it rained, you were already waterproof. Homemade trash bag costumes were the ultimate symbol of 1980s ingenuity, messy, last minute, and completely unforgettable. By the mid-1980s, rumors about poisoned candy and hidden razor blades had parents terrified. That is why local police stations and fire departments began offering safety check events where kids could get their candy x-rayed. It sounds extreme now, but back then it was comforting to see uniformed officers dumping your plastic pumpkin onto a metal table. The whirring of the machine and the click of buttons made the whole process feel official, almost like a spy mission. Kids would wait anxiously for their candy to come out clean, cheering when their stash passed the test. Sometimes an officer would sneak a piece of candy and wink, reminding everyone that Halloween was supposed to be fun, not frightening. You would watch the candy pass through the machine like treasure through airport security, and once it was cleared, it somehow tasted better. The event turned fear into community, flashing lights, parents chatting, kids showing off costumes under the station's bright fluorescence. No one ever actually found anything dangerous, but that was not the point. It was about reassurance, about the idea that everyone was looking out for each other. The poisoned candy panic may have been overblown, but it created one of the most unique traditions of 1980s Halloween, one that mixed caution with comfort. Before LED armbands and smartphone flashlights, kids stayed safe on Halloween with glow sticks and reflective tape. Parents handed out glowing necklaces, bracelets, and strips of silver tape like armor against the dark. You could spot your friends from halfway down the block, neon green, bright orange, and ghostly blue, moving through the night. Cracking a glow stick was a ceremony of its own. The satisfying snap, the swirl of color spreading through the tube, the awe on every kid's face. Some kids wore 5 or 6 at once, transforming into walking neon skeletons. When the batteries died or the glow faded, it felt like the night itself was winding down. It gave every trick-or-treater a space-age look, like an army of glowing robots marching for candy. The faint chemical smell of a freshly cracked glow stick was oddly exciting. It meant the night was officially starting. Parents called it safety gear, but to kids it just felt cool. Reflective tape on sneakers, jackets, and pumpkin buckets made you look ready for adventure, even if your costume was falling apart. Halloween in the 1980s might have been spooky, but it was also unmistakably bright. No 1980s. Halloween was complete without a spooky sound effect cassette. You could buy them at Radio Shack, Kmart, or the local drugstore, each promising to turn your living room into a haunted mansion. The tapes were filled with endless loops of creaking doors, howling wolves, thunderclaps, and distant screams. You could always tell which house had one playing. The sound spilled out onto the street, luring kids closer like a siren. Some tapes even had scratchy narration, adding a ghostly story that made your imagination run wild. The occasional tape jam only made it better, warping the sounds into something even creepier. Parents would press play on an old cassette deck and hide it behind a curtain, letting the sounds echo through the house. The low hiss of the tape added an eerie realism that no streaming playlist can match today. Kids tried to talk over it during parties, but the sudden shrieks always made someone jump. These cheap cassettes were the soundtrack of every backyard haunt, every garage maze, every night of pillowcase candy halls. The fact that it was just a tape made it feel like a secret power. You could summon fear with the push of a button. It was do-it-yourself horror at its finest, the heartbeat of a decade that loved making its own fun. In the 1980s, no Halloween decoration was complete without those delicate paper honeycomb pumpkins. They came folded flat in plastic sleeves, waiting for the moment you would pull them open and fasten the tiny paperclip to hold their round shape. Suddenly, you had a full 3D pumpkin, or a black cat with a bow tie, ready to sit proudly on the kitchen table. The tissue paper was so thin it tore if you looked at it too hard, yet every family had at least one that somehow survived, year after year. The smell of dusty cardboard and old paper was unmistakable when you pulled it from the decorations box each October. These honeycomb crafts gave homes that cozy, low-budget charm that only 1980s Halloween could perfect. They hung from ceiling fans, school windows, and office bulletin boards, glowing orange under fluorescent lights. No one cared that they were fragile or cheap. They were part of the ritual. That simple act of unfolding paper and watching a flat shape become something magical felt like the true start of the season. They were the humble heart of Halloween decorating, bright, delicate, and unforgettable. Pumpkin carving kits in the 1980s promised to make carving safe and easy for everyone. They came in cheerful orange boxes with plastic scoops, tiny saws, and pattern sheets showing ghosts, cats, or goofy grins. Parents loved them because they looked safer than kitchen knives, even though those plastic tools could barely cut butter. Every kid remembers that feeling of scraping out slimy pumpkin guts with the dull little scoop while the smell of raw pumpkin filled the kitchen. The flimsy saw would bend halfway through the first eye, but we pushed through anyway, determined to make something spooky. Carving was a family event. Newspapers spread across the table, candles waiting nearby, and someone always yelling about saving the seeds to roast later. Even the failed attempts were fun. You could tell which pumpkins belonged to kids because the mouths were jagged and the teeth were enormous. But when you dropped that candle inside and turned off the lights, it all came together. Those glowing, uneven jack-o'-lanterns sitting on porches were proof that Halloween had truly arrived. Every October morning in the 1980s began with a sugary bowl of monster cereal. Count Chocula, Boo Berry, and Frankenberry ruled breakfast tables with their pastel marshmallows and spooky mascots. But it was not just the cereal that mattered. It was the box. Kids would flip it over and see cutout masks, monster puzzles, or glow-in-the-dark stickers that made breakfast feel like a mini adventure. Some boxes even came with mail-in offers for collectible toys or posters if you sent in enough box tops. Saturday mornings were spent with milk-stained scissors, cutting out masks that never fit quite right but made you feel like part of the monster crew. These cereal promotions blended sugar, marketing genius, and pure childhood magic. The monsters were not scary. They were funny, friendly, and just the right kind of spooky for kids who were too young for real horror movies. Even the jingles stuck in your head long after Halloween ended. Looking back, it was the perfect mix of fun and flavor. Breakfast that doubled as a costume factory. Teen Halloween dances in the 1980s were something out of a movie, literally. The gym was covered in orange and black streamers, paper bats hung from basketball hoops, and a fog machine turned the floor into a dreamlike swamp. The DJ played Thriller at least 5 times a night, and no one ever got tired of it. Couples slow danced under plastic skeletons, while teachers in vampire capes pretended not to notice kids sneaking soda from spiked punch bowls. Costume contests were the highlight, and the competition was fierce. You could not just show up in a mask, you needed lights, fake blood, and commitment. Even the shy kids got swept up in the excitement. There was something magical about the combination of cheap decorations, loud music, and the thrill of being seen in costume outside of class. It was goofy, awkward, and unforgettable, a night where everyone got to be a little wild behind the safety of makeup and masks. Those themed school dances made Halloween feel grown up, yet innocent all at once. As the decade wore on, latex monster masks became the ultimate Halloween flex. You could smell them from across the aisle at Spencer's or the local drugstore. That weird mix of rubber and chemical paint that meant quality. These masks were not the thin plastic kind. They were heavy, realistic, and terrifying. Slip one on, and you were instantly a werewolf, zombie, or melting skull straight out of a nightmare. They were expensive too, so kids often shared them or wore them year after year until the eye holes cracked. The inside always stuck to your face, and after 10 minutes, you were sweating like crazy, but it did not matter. These gory, rubber masks made you the coolest kid on the block. Adults would jump, little kids would scream, and you would grin behind layers of latex and fake blood. They were hot, smelly, and impossible to breathe in, but no costume made a bigger impression. For a single night, you were the monster, and you loved every second of it. Television ruled the 1980s, and Halloween was when it truly came alive. Every major network hosted movie marathons that ran late into the night. Titles like Halloween 2, Psycho, and Night of the Living Dead played between commercials for candy, costumes, and long-distance phone plans. The anticipation was half the fun. The moment that eerie bumper flashed on screen, kids would dive for their blankets and popcorn bowls. Even the commercials became part of the ritual, little flashes of neon nostalgia that made the night feel endless. Parents tried to act calm, but you could see them peek through their fingers during the jump scares. Families would huddle together on the couch with popcorn, half scared and half laughing at the bad special effects. These marathons turned ordinary nights into spooky events shared across the country. The glowing television light, the static hum between programs, even the station bumpers featuring skeletons and lightning bolts. It was all part of the experience. Kids who were too young to stay up would sneak out of bed just to catch a glimpse of the horror magic. There were no streaming platforms or pause buttons. If you missed it, you missed it. And that made it special. Those movie marathons taught a whole generation what fear felt like, not from monsters on the screen, but from knowing you had to sleep after watching them. If you were lucky enough to have cable in the 1980s, you knew that October on MTV was an event. The channel transformed into a non-stop Halloween party filled with fog machines, neon lights, and rock stars who looked straight out of a haunted house. Music videos from Michael Jackson, Alice Cooper, and Ozzy Osbourne turned every living room into a teenage vampire's dream. You could almost feel the static from the television in the air as your heart thumped to the beat of Thriller. Every segment felt like a glimpse into a world where Halloween and rock music shared the same soul. Even the commercials were cool, flashy promos that made you want to record everything on a blank VHS tape just to keep the vibe alive. VJs wore costumes, ran contests for the best homemade videos, and played horror-themed music countdowns that lasted all weekend. You would sit inches from the television, mesmerized by flashing lights and guitar riffs that felt rebellious and spooky at once. MTV's Halloween specials defined cool. They made the holiday feel electric, modern, and full of attitude. Watching them with friends meant you were in on something bigger, a shared culture of music, mischief, and creativity. For kids growing up in suburban neighborhoods, MTV turned Halloween from a night of candy into a full-blown cultural moment. Mischief Night was as much a part of the Halloween season as candy itself. The night before Halloween, October 30th, belonged to the teenagers. Armed with toilet paper, eggs, and shaving cream, they roamed quiet suburban streets looking for trouble. The glow of streetlights cut through the fog as laughter echoed in the distance, a soundtrack of mischief and rebellion. Even the calmest neighborhoods turned into playgrounds of harmless chaos. Somewhere, a radio played faintly from a car parked with its lights off, the unofficial anthem of Mischief Night. Teachers' houses were prime targets, and even the best-behaved kids could not resist joining in. The thrill came not from causing damage, but from getting away with it. The air smelled like damp leaves and teenage adrenaline. You could hear laughter echoing through the neighborhood, followed by the soft splat of eggs on car windshields. Parents pretended not to know what was happening, as long as no one got caught. It was harmless chaos, a way for kids to let out steam before the sugar rush of Halloween. By morning, lawns were draped in toilet paper like ghostly streamers, a quiet, funny reminder that mischief was still alive and well in the suburbs. Every region had its own late-night monster movie host, and they were as much a part of Halloween as candy corn. Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, was the undisputed queen, with her sharp wit and gothic glamour. But local stations had their own icons: Count Gordevol, Goulardi, or even unnamed Creepy Carl types who introduced old horror flicks between corny jokes and bad puns. They were part comedian, part ringmaster, and part babysitter for every kid sneaking TV past midnight. The crackle of the local station's signal, the host's booming laugh, and the low-budget props made it all feel personal. In a world before the internet, they were our strange, wonderful guides through the shadows. They broadcast from tiny studios decorated with fake cobwebs and rubber bats. But to kids staying up past bedtime, it felt like a secret world. The movies they showed were usually low-budget classics, filled with rubber monsters and grainy film. Yet those hosts made them unforgettable. Their humor softened the scares, turning horror into something cozy and communal. Watching them felt like hanging out with an eccentric friend who loved Halloween as much as you did. They made the weird feel welcoming, and every terrible movie a little more fun. Halloween lunchboxes in the 1980s were a mini celebration all on their own. Moms went all out, packing thermoses of hot apple cider and sandwich bags of candy corn next to peanut butter sandwiches. Hostess rolled out limited edition scary cakes with orange frosting and chocolate bats, and kids traded them like currency at lunch tables. You could hear the faint crinkle of wax paper and smell the sweet mix of sugar and apples as kids compared their lunches. Sometimes someone would sneak in a tiny candy bar early and instantly become a hero. Even the lunchboxes themselves, tin, colorful, and dented from years of use, were part of the ritual. Some kids even had Halloween-themed lunchboxes covered in pumpkins or cartoon ghosts. Opening your lunch felt like unwrapping a party in the middle of a school day. The cafeteria buzzed with sugar and excitement, everyone counting down the hours until trick-or-treating began. Even the smell of apple cider mixed with crayons and floor wax felt nostalgic. It was a small, comforting reminder that Halloween was about joy as much as fear. Those themed lunchbox treats were simple, homemade gestures that made kids feel seen and special. A tiny bit of October magic tucked between math and recess. The smell of pumpkin-scented candles and potpourri was the unofficial perfume of every 1980s October. You could walk into any suburban home and instantly know it was Halloween season. That mix of cinnamon, wax, and artificial pumpkin that seemed to cling to your clothes. The candles came in glass jars shaped like little pumpkins or squat brown tins with cheerful orange labels. Moms would light them hours before anyone arrived, just to make sure the whole house smelled festive. The scent mixed with the faint aroma of plastic decorations and hot glue from craft projects left to dry on the counter. It was comforting and overwhelming all at once. Sweet, spicy, and unmistakably fake. Potpourri bowls were another staple, filled with dried leaves, wood chips, and mysterious orange peels sprayed with harvest fragrance. Sometimes they came with tiny plastic pumpkins or sparkly spiders mixed in because everything in the 1980s needed decoration. Even the air was seasonal. Those scents defined October as much as the costumes or candy. They made living rooms feel like warm, safe bubbles from the cold outside world. You could sit on the couch, watch a Halloween special, and smell autumn in a jar. Long after the candles burned out and the potpourri lost its scent, that memory stayed. It was the smell of comfort, family, and fall itself, bottled and ready for every year's return. Glow-in-the-dark window clings were a Halloween miracle wrapped in cheap plastic. Every kitchen, classroom, and front window in the 1980s had at least a few. Bright green ghosts, crooked pumpkins, or grinning black cats that looked best under a porch light. You peeled them off their backing and smoothed them onto glass with small, sticky hands. The thrill came at night when they glowed faintly, turning windows into mini haunted displays. They were reusable in theory, but after a few weeks, they collected dust, lint, and dog hair until they looked like haunted moss. Even so, no one threw them away. Moms carefully peeled them off and stuck them on wax paper, storing them in the decorations box for next year. By Christmas, most windows still had faint ghost outlines that refused to wash off, glowing a little less each week. Kids would press their faces to the glass, admiring the eerie green shapes shining against the dark. These clings were small, simple, and magical. A piece of low-tech wonder that made even an ordinary kitchen window feel like part of Halloween night. They did not need batteries or screens, just the simple joy of glowing in the dark. Before themed buckets and designer treat bags, Halloween in the 1980s was ruled by paper grocery sacks. Stores like Safeway, Winn-Dixie, and Piggly Wiggly gave out their own branded trick-or-treat bags covered in cartoon ghosts, smiling pumpkins, and bold store logos. Kids would line up near the entrance, clutching these paper treasures like golden tickets. The bags were huge, promising endless candy, until it rained or the bottom tore halfway through the night. You could tell who had the best haul by whose bag was reinforced with duct tape by the end of the evening. Parents loved the convenience, and grocery stores loved the free advertising. It was the perfect marriage of commerce and candy. The artwork on those bags was pure 1980s charm. Thick outlines, goofy ghosts, and fonts that looked hand-drawn. Kids would sometimes color them in with crayons while waiting for trick-or-treat time to start. The crinkling sound of the bag swinging at your side became part of the night's rhythm, mixing with the crunch of leaves underfoot. Even when plastic pumpkin buckets started taking over, the old paper bag still had soul. It represented a simpler Halloween, one built on community, local stores, and the excitement of seeing how much candy one bag could really hold. Local radio stations in the 1980s treated Halloween like a community event. DJs hosted call-in costume contests where listeners described their outfits live on air and hoped to win movie tickets, cassette tapes, or free pizza coupons. Some stations even organized drive-by parades, setting up tents in parking lots where families could pull up, show off costumes, and honk for prizes. The excitement crackled through the airwaves, spooky sound effects between songs, DJs laughing at corny jokes, and callers breathlessly describing homemade werewolf costumes made of old fur coats. The contests brought towns together before social media ever could. You would sit in the car with your parents, the heater humming, waiting to hear if your neighbor or classmate won. Sometimes the radio would play Thriller or Ghostbusters, and everyone in the car would sing along. It was fun, loud, and completely local. There was pride in hearing your small-town station go all in for Halloween. The prizes were cheap, but the bragging rights were priceless. Winning a radio contest felt like being famous for one night. Long before podcasts or live streams, these Halloween broadcasts turned ordinary evenings into shared celebrations that stretched across every driveway and diner in town. Candy corn was everywhere in the 1980s, not because anyone loved it, but because it was tradition. Every coffee table, teacher's desk, and front hallway had a bowl filled to the brim with those shiny orange, yellow, and white triangles. They looked cheerful and festive, catching the light like tiny pieces of waxy treasure. But no one actually ate them, at least not more than a handful. They were too sweet, too grainy, too weird. Yet every year, new bags appeared like clockwork, poured into glass bowls shaped like pumpkins or cornucopias. Sometimes they were mixed with peanuts or chocolate, as if that would help. Kids would sneak one or two, make a face, and put the bowl back exactly as they found it. Still, the sight of candy corn meant Halloween had officially arrived. It was the edible equivalent of a jack-o'-lantern, decorative, nostalgic, and unnecessary. Parents bought it because their parents had, and somehow it became a ritual of its own. The bright colors, the sugary smell, and the way it stuck together in clumps all felt comforting in their own strange way. Even today, the taste instantly brings back memories of plastic tablecloths, fake spider webs, and a simpler time when candy corn did not need to be good. It just needed to be there. You knew a kid was cool if their necklace made noise from down the hallway. Enter the plastic charm necklace. These things were a fashion statement and a choking hazard all rolled into one. A long, brightly colored chain that you decked out with dozens of plastic trinkets. Mini roller skates, tiny telephones, hair dryers, soda bottles, and anything else the size of your thumb. The more charms, the better. It was like curating your own loud, clunky resume of childhood interests. Everyone traded them. Everyone bragged about having the rare ones. And of course, the plastic was cheap enough to snap if you breathed on it wrong. Teachers hated them. Parents hated stepping on them. But kids loved how collectible they felt. That is, until the day you leaned over your desk and your entire charm empire dumped itself on the floor like a sad little toy avalanche. Still, for a while, they were the perfect combination of fashion and fun. And speaking of things that looked fun but failed to function properly, do you remember the sweet-smelling school supply that never actually worked? Let us talk about rubber-scented erasers shaped like food. Limited extracurricular activities were just another way the world reminded you what you could not afford. Other kids had piano lessons, karate classes, and sports teams with matching uniforms. You had afternoons at home watching TV or playing outside with a stick and a rock. Sign-up fees were too high, equipment cost too much. Even the rides to practice were out of reach if the car was needed for work. You brought home the flyers from school and left them on the table, hoping. Sometimes they just disappeared. Sometimes your parents gently explained that maybe next time meant probably never. You cheered from the sidelines, you watched from the crowd, and you learned how to clap with a smile even when your heart wanted in. It was not fair, it stung, but you found other ways to grow. You read library books, you drew comics in the margins of your notebook, you played tag until the sun went down, and maybe you missed out on trophies and tournaments, but you learned resilience, creativity, and how to find joy in the quiet spaces. You might not have worn the jersey, but you still showed up. And that mattered. Acid-wash jeans were loud before you even opened your mouth. With their blotchy patterns and faded splotches, they looked like someone had taken a bleach bottle to denim, and somehow, that became cool. These jeans were rebellious, messy, and unmistakably 1980s. Everyone had a pair. Some wore them tight-rolled at the ankle, others let them drape over high-top sneakers. Acid wash showed up in jackets, skirts, and full matching sets that turned entire outfits into walking eye strain. You could not blend in wearing acid wash. You stood out, and that was the point. It was denim with attitude. Rough, bold, a little chaotic. Parents hated it. Teachers rolled their eyes. But teens embraced the weirdness. It felt edgy, like you were wearing the uniform of a generation that refused to dress quietly. Old photographs now show groups of kids lined up in front of lockers, each one looking like they had just emerged from a bleach accident and loving it. Acid wash was not timeless, it was not flattering, but it was unforgettable. And in a decade known for excess, it fit right in. Even now, pulling on an old pair brings back the noise, the neon, and the thrill of breaking the fashion rules. The oddball roadside museum was where logic went to take a nap. You saw the hand-painted sign from the highway. Come see the world's largest pencil, or America's first toaster, still works. Dad would swerve into the gravel lot like it was destiny. Admission was cheap, $3 cash only, and worth every penny. The inside was a fever dream. Display cases filled with bottle caps from all 50 states. A whole wall dedicated to vintage shampoo bottles. A two-headed taxidermy calf that haunted your dreams for a week. "You brought the kid today, huh?" he would say, as if Dad came here weekly. You followed them through rooms of strange collections while Dad laughed and read every single placard out loud. It was like watching a kid in a candy store, only the candy was lawn darts, Pez dispensers, and World War II ration kits. "Now this," Dad would say, holding up a glass jar with something floating in it. "This is history." And even though you rolled your eyes, part of you agreed. But if you really want to feel history in motion, just wait until you join him by the old train tracks, watching boxcars roll by, counting like your life depended on it. The 1980s were not just colorful, they were textured. Enter puffy paint clothing projects where kids became designers and your closet turned into a craft aisle. You would grab an oversized sweatshirt, some neon puffy paint, and go to town. Maybe your name in bubble letters. Maybe a dolphin jumping over a rainbow. Maybe just abstract blobs of color that looked like a melted ice cream truck. The point was not perfection. It was personality. These paints dried thick and rubbery, forming crusty shapes that cracked after one wash. And forget drying time. You had to leave that sweatshirt on a hanger for a day, hoping no one touched it and left fingerprints in the masterpiece. Once dry, you wore it proudly, to school, to the mall, to family dinner. But comfort? Out the window. The back of the paint rubbed against your skin like sandpaper. Heaven forbid someone hugged you. You would both end up glittery. Still, it was a rite of creative passage. You were a walking art exhibit whether you liked it or not. But if you thought your sweatshirt was stiff, wait until you remember the home appliance that tried to combine two technologies and ended up giving you the worst of both worlds. Limited access to cable television in the 1980s meant your world came through rabbit ears. You had the basics, network channels, maybe a grainy local station or two. But when friends talked about Nickelodeon, MTV, or the Disney Channel, you just smiled and nodded, pretending you knew what they meant. Your TV had an antenna wrapped in aluminum foil. Your Saturday mornings were for cartoons on the few channels that came in clear. You learned to adjust the rabbit ears just right, then sit perfectly still, because moving even an inch might send the screen back into static. You missed out on the cable exclusive shows, the big movie nights, the flashy channels with round-the-clock music videos. You got public access, reruns, and news that ended with the national anthem. At school, you heard about shows you never saw. You laughed along anyway. At home, you made the most of what you had. Limited channels meant fewer choices, but also fewer arguments. You watched whatever was on. You made it work. And you learned something strange. When there was only one option, it often became your favorite. The picture was not perfect, but it was yours. And sometimes, that was enough. Mixtapes were handwritten love letters wrapped in cassette cases. You waited by the radio for hours just to hit record at the perfect moment. trying to catch the start of your favorite song without the DJ talking over it. You rewound, replayed, and carefully curated the perfect order so each track melted into the next. Some were made for crushes, others for best friends. Some were sorry tapes, and some were just because. Each one had a theme, a purpose, and a heart behind it. You picked songs that said what you could not. Then you labeled the tape in your best handwriting, maybe decorated the case, and handed it over like it was treasure. Because it was. A great mixtape took hours, sometimes days, to get just right. And when someone gave you one, you listened to it until the tape wore thin and the sound warped. Mixtapes were not just music. They were memories, feelings, time capsules wrapped in magnetic ribbon. And long after the songs faded, you remembered the person who made it, their handwriting, their choices, their message. Even now, in a world of playlists, nothing hits quite like the soft click of a tape deck and a song you once recorded just for someone else. The used bookstore with the ham radios in the back was the kind of place where time folded in on itself. You walked in and the smell hit you first. Paper, dust, and something that might have been pipe smoke from 50 years ago. Dad would head for the nonfiction section like it was a treasure map, and you would start flipping through comics that had long-forgotten characters in them. Every wall was covered in books, stacked too deep, sometimes sideways, sometimes just crammed in with no regard for order. But the real secret was in the back room. That was where the ham radios lived. Static buzzed from old speakers, and every now and then a voice would crackle through saying something like, "Calling from Connecticut. Do you copy?" Dad would nod slowly, say, "Nice rig," and start talking shop with the owner like they were part of some invisible club. You never understood a word of it, but it felt cool anyway, like your dad knew something no one else did. He would pick up a radio, fiddle with a dial, and say, "This one's got personality." The man behind the counter always nodded like that meant something. But if you thought that place had character, wait until you see Dad at the county auction barn, outbidding strangers for a box of who knows what. If you had a motorized toy watch in the 1980s, you were basically James Bond for about a day. These things were advertised as cutting-edge wearable tech for kids. They came with secret compartments, built-in games, tiny motors, and sometimes a mini flashlight that barely lit up a crayon box. It was like strapping a malfunctioning robot to your wrist. The appeal was instant. They looked cool, they blinked, they buzzed. But they rarely did any of it well. Most of the time, they stopped working after a couple of recesses. Batteries died fast, buttons got stuck, the motors jammed. And the plastic? Usually cracked if you smacked it against a desk. But for that brief window when it worked, you felt invincible. Until the alarm started going off randomly in class and your teacher confiscated it. Or worse, you opened the compartment only to find that whatever secret feature it had just did not. But still, you wore it proudly, because style always beat functionality in the 1980s. And nowhere was that more true than in the next trend. A fashion accessory that tried to blast your favorite jams but mostly just sat on your hip doing nothing at all. Using layaway plans was how your family brought home the things they could not afford all at once. The process was simple but long. You picked something out, paid a little now, and waited. Every week or every paycheck, your parents went back to the store and handed over a few more dollars. The items stayed behind the counter, out of reach, until that last payment clicked everything into place. Maybe it was a winter coat. Maybe it was a bike for Christmas. Sometimes it was furniture or shoes or something that felt big, because it was. You did not get instant gratification. You got slow, hard-earned reward. There was no credit card swipe, no overnight shipping, just weeks of waiting, hoping, and counting. You learned patience. You learned value. And when that final receipt was signed, it felt like winning something impossible. Other families might have walked out with full bags. Yours walked out with pride. Layaway meant you were not giving up. You were building towards something, one payment at a time. And even now, when you buy something in full, you still feel that echo, the deep understanding that waiting made it sweeter. Over-the-top hairdos in the 1980s were less about style and more about spectacle. To get that perfect towering poof or side-swept shell, you needed a can of hairspray in one hand and a teasing comb in the other. Some mornings, the bathroom turned into a construction site. Hair was sprayed, scrunched, fluffed, and frozen into place like a sculpture that dared not move. Mousse was slathered on like sunscreen, followed by heat from a curling iron so hot it could leave permanent dents in your bangs. It was a daily battle between gravity and vanity usually won. The bigger the hair, the closer to cool. Class photos from the decade show clouds of bangs, mile-high ponytails, and helmets of blonde that could survive a wind tunnel. Everyone walked around smelling faintly of aerosol. Some kids were practically flammable, but at the time, it was worth it. You judged your popularity by the size of your bangs. A flat head was social suicide. Looking back now, it seems absurd, but for those who lived it, there was no higher compliment than being told your hair looked totally rad. The go-kart track with zero safety rules looked like it was built by someone who once saw a racetrack in a dream and then tried to recreate it with duct tape and a prayer. The sign out front read, "Family Fun." But you knew this was Dad's kind of fun. He paid cash to a man with a sunburn and a clipboard, and before you knew it, you were strapping into a plastic rocket with wheels. No seatbelt, no helmet, just a stern warning. Do not hit your sister. Dad, of course, was already in his own cart, revving the engine like it was the Daytona 500. The track was a cracked loop with grass growing through it and tires stacked too high as a boundary. The exhaust fumes were strong enough to water your eyes, and the cart screeched like a choir of angry lawnmowers. You skidded, bumped, and spun out more than once, but you never forgot the thrill. Especially when Dad passed you on the last lap, one hand on the wheel, the other waving smugly. That victory lap? It lasted all week, and if you were lucky, he would let you stay just a little longer, because the community swap meet down at the church lot was about to open, and Dad never missed that one. All came together for the golden age of synth pop in the 1980s, and while some bands carved out legacies that still echo today, there were many that burst onto the scene with one song, rode the radio waves hard, and then vanished like a fog machine in a gymnasium. These were the one-hit wonders of synth pop. Groups with names that sounded like computer errors, album covers that looked like laser tag invitations, and beats that could only be danced to under a disco ball or beneath neon lights. You probably remember the song, maybe even the music video, but ask someone to name a second track and all you will get is a confused look. They were catchy, addictive, and short-lived. It was like the sound itself had an expiration date. Still, the moment they were hot, they were hot. The genre was all style, minimal substance, and maximum eyeliner. But when the synthesizers started to fade and guitars came roaring back, these acts had nowhere to go. Much like their lyrics, they just drifted into the static. But if the music was fleeting, the next trend tried to leave its mark forever, sometimes quite literally, on your notebook paper. Heating only one room in winter was not just a strategy, it was survival. The whole house might be freezing, but one space stayed warm. Maybe it was the living room with a kerosene heater. Maybe the kitchen with the oven door cracked open. You brought in extra blankets. You wore your coat indoors. Everyone piled in, like penguins sharing body heat. You did homework at the coffee table, ate soup from mismatched bowls, slept on the couch or a pile of comforters laid out on the floor. The hallway felt like Antarctica. The bathroom? A short, icy sprint. At night, the cold crept into your bones, but during the day, you all huddled in that one room like it was the center of the universe. Parents told kids to keep the door shut. Do not let the heat out. No one dared argue. It was about bills, about making it to spring. And even though it felt unfair at the time, it also brought people close. Literally, you learned to share space, to pass the time, to be warm in more ways than one. Heating one room was not ideal, but it was home, and somehow it got you through. Trapper keepers were not just school supplies, they were status symbols. With their Velcro flaps and glossy over-the-top covers, they turned every classroom into a silent competition of who had the coolest binder. Some featured racing cars, Others showed rainbows, unicorns, or abstract laser patterns straight out of a sci-fi fever dream. Inside, everything was neatly organized. Folders, dividers, loose-leaf paper, and secret notes passed during math class. The Velcro made a loud rip every time you opened it, an announcement that learning was about to begin, or at least be attempted. Trapper Keepers made you feel like you had your life together, even if your grades said otherwise. Teachers had a love-hate relationship with them. They were bulky, distracting, but undeniably effective at keeping your stuff in one place. And if you had one with a matching pencil case, you were royalty. Years later, people still remember the smell of the plastic, the feel of flipping through those laminated folders, and the thrill of sliding in a new pack of notebook paper. Trapper Keepers were not just for school, they were for showing off, staying organized, and feeling like you had a little piece of the future in your backpack. The miniature golf course with homemade obstacles was never part of a chain. It was part of someone's backyard that got out of hand. The fence leaned, the AstroTurf peeled at the corners, and the scorecards were photocopies from sometime around 1967. But to Dad, this was sacred ground. "Watch out for the windmill," he would say, pointing to a lopsided contraption that spun more out of habit than engineering. Hole 6 had a dinosaur, once green, now a sad grayish blue with a missing eye, and hole 9 was uphill into what looked like a mailbox from a sci-fi movie. Dad kept score with one of those tiny pencils, sometimes generous, sometimes forgetting that penalty stroke. He cheered every shot like you had just qualified for a Masters tournament, and when he sunk a hole in one, he would raise his hands like he had won a trophy. The best part? Ice cream sandwiches at the end, slightly melted from the cooler behind the counter. You never asked for anything more. But if the ground game was that magical, just wait until you went airborne, watching planes take off from a sleepy little airport that felt like your own private runway. There was a time when men's fashion turned into a pastel explosion. Inspired by Miami Vice, pastel blazers became the go-to power move for any guy who wanted to look cool, sophisticated, and vaguely like he sold luxury boats. The look was unmistakable. Shoulder-padded jackets in baby blue, mint green, or pale pink, paired with white pants and an attitude. You rolled up the sleeves. You wore it over a t-shirt. Bonus points if you wore loafers with no socks. It was supposed to say, confident renegade. More often, it said, confused ice cream vendor. It was television fantasy brought into everyday wardrobes, and it did not always survive the transition. Most men were not undercover detectives in Miami. They were accountants in Michigan. The style clashed with the office cubicles and suburban backyards where it showed up. And once the show faded from prime time, so did the look. The pastel blazer became fashion's forgotten relic. But if you thought that was an eyesore, wait until you see the avalanche of snot, slime, and absurdity that came from the most chaotic merchandise blitz of the 1980s. Garbage Pail Kids were just getting started. Using public transportation exclusively meant your life moved on someone else's schedule. There was no jumping in the car for milk, no last-minute rides. You waited. At bus stops, on corners, in the rain, in the cold, in your Sunday best or your work shoes. The bus was never early. Sometimes it was late. But you waited. You held a pocketful of exact change. Maybe a transfer stub. You knew the routes like the back of your hand. You sat near the front if you were tired. In the back if you did not want to talk. You watched strangers argue, laugh, cry. You saw your city from a different view, block by block, stop by stop. Owning a car seemed like another world. Gas, insurance, repairs. Those were luxuries. The bus was what you had. And it was enough. Sort of. It got you to school, to work, to church. You learned to carry groceries in bags that would not break. You made friends with the drivers. You memorized delays. And when the ride was over, you stepped off into whatever came next. Public transportation did not just move you. It taught you patience, resilience, and how to hold on when the brakes hit hard. Scratch and sniff stickers made notebooks smell like fruit salad or something pretending to be. Grape, banana, pizza, popcorn. If it existed, there was probably a sticker that gave off a chemical approximation of it. These tiny scented rewards were currency on the playground. You earned them from teachers, you traded them with friends, you collected them in sticker books and flipped through your favorites like a sommelier of glue and artificial scent. Some smelled better than others. Some were so strong they made your eyes water. Others lost their smell after a few scratches but were kept anyway, honored like faded trophies. You knew the popular ones: root beer, bubble gum, and anything with glitter. You also knew the duds, like liverwurst or mystery meat, that somehow ended up in your binder anyway. Scratching a sticker in class was a quiet act of rebellion. You were not supposed to, but you did. And then you passed the notebook around so others could sniff and nod in approval, or gag in horror. Scratch and sniff stickers were low-tech fun with high nostalgic value. They turned paper into treasure. And even today, one whiff of fake strawberry is enough to transport you straight back to third grade with a smile. The small-town airport was barely an airport at all. A cracked runway, 2 hangars, and a chain-link fence with holes big enough to stick your face through. But Dad? He treated it like Kennedy Space Center. He would park the car at the edge of the lot, pop the hood up just enough for shade, and sit with a root beer balanced on the hood like he was waiting for clearance to launch. You joined him, legs swinging off the bumper, eyes on the horizon. Cessnas came and went, some buzzing overhead like dragonflies, others taxiing so slow it felt like they were afraid to leave the ground. "That one's a Skyhawk," Dad would say, as if naming a friend. "Twin engine, listen to the pitch." You nodded, pretending to hear the difference. Every now and then someone would land rough, and Dad would let out a low whistle. Bet he felt that one. The sun dipped lower. The planes grew fewer. But the quiet stuck with you, the feeling that for a few minutes the sky belonged to you. And when Dad said, "Let's stop by the photo shop on the way home," you knew the magic was about to get printed. If the lights went out in the 1980s, chances are something in your room lit up. Glow-in-the-dark stickers were slapped on every surface known to humankind. Bedroom ceilings became constellations. Alarm clocks glowed like miniature UFOs. Light switch covers, shoelaces, trapper keepers, even toothbrushes. Nothing was safe from the radioactive green charm of phosphorescent novelty. And as a kid, it was magic. You charged them up under a lamp, turned off the lights, and suddenly your room was a planetarium. Sort of. The glow would last about 30 seconds. And then, nothing. But those 30 seconds? Pure wonder. The problem came when the adhesive gave out and the stickers peeled off, leaving weird, dusty outlines on your walls. Or when the glow effect faded completely, leaving behind little blobs of dead plastic. Still, the trend exploded. Kids wanted to glow. Toys were made with it. T-shirts were printed with it. Some even tried to make glow-in-the-dark nail polish. The 80s loved the idea of visibility, especially in the dark. But while glowing stars were subtle, the next trend was anything but. Let us talk about the fashion moment that made teenagers look like they were headed straight for the football field. Shoulder pads, anyone? Shared bedrooms among siblings meant privacy was a myth and bedtime was an adventure. 2, sometimes 3 kids in one room, bunk beds, fold-out couches, mattresses on the floor. You learned to sleep through snoring, giggling, and whispered arguments over who stole the blanket. One lamp lit the room. One drawer held everyone's socks. If you wanted quiet, you closed your eyes and hoped for sleep. But there was love there too. Late-night stories, secret jokes, a flashlight under the covers. You made forts out of sheets and built walls with pillows, pretending they were rooms of your own. You learned to share without thinking, to wait your turn, to keep secrets. Sure, you fought. You drew invisible lines down the mattress. But you also looked out for each other, listened when someone cried, celebrated the nights when no one got in trouble. Those cramped quarters built closeness you never asked for, but maybe needed. And years later, you remembered those rooms not for the lack of space, but for the way they held you together. Shared bedrooms were loud, messy, and full of life. And even now, you sometimes miss what it meant to fall asleep beside someone who knew you by heart. If you were a kid in the 1980s, there were two ways to rebel. You could get grounded, or you could collect Garbage Pail Kids. What started as a gross-out parody of wholesome Cabbage Patch Kids quickly mutated into one of the most controversial and overstimulating franchises of the decade. The trading cards were wild enough, oozing noses, melting eyeballs, radioactive vomit. But that was just the beginning. Suddenly, they were everywhere. Garbage Pail Kids lunchboxes, bed sheets, pajamas, notebooks, puzzles, even Halloween costumes. It was like someone said, "What if childhood was more disgusting?" And the market responded, "Yes, please." Parents hated them, teachers banned them, some schools even confiscated them on site. But for kids, they were pure rebellion in sticker form. Every new pack was a gamble. Would you get Atom Bomb or Leaky Lindsay? Either way, it was peak 1980s absurdity, but the brand overdid it. What once felt underground became overexposed, and by the time the infamous Garbage Pail Kids movie dropped in theaters, it was game over. Gross became exhausting. The merch wave collapsed under its own snot-covered weight. Still, it was fun while it lasted. Now, let us talk about another trend that looked sweet and innocent, until summer arrived and your feet begged for mercy. If these forgotten Halloween memories made you smile, tell us your favorite 1980s tradition in the comments, give that like button a good scare, and subscribe so you never miss another trip back to the spooky, candy-filled past.